The Order of Jesus is one of the most mysterious and controversial organizations in church history. In terms of popularity, it is second only to the Inquisition. The word Jesuit has become synonymous with hypocrite and cunning schemer. What has earned the Society of Jesus such a reputation? How fair is it? What else did the Jesuits do besides intrigue and conspiracy? Let's try to understand. Gustav Leibniz in his work, Psychology of Peoples and Masses, aptly noted that a truly charismatic leader must be crazy. The personality of the founder of the Jesuit order is a perfect confirmation of this. The history of the order begins with the story of the Spanish aristocrat Inigo de Loyola, who in his youth was very fond of chivalric novels and character in many ways resembled Don Quixote from the famous book by Cervantes, written a little later. Loyola was constantly drawn to chivalric feats in the name of the beautiful lady. In 1521, Inigo, no longer a boy, but a 30-year-old man, finally got at Pamplona in a real battle. Navarrese decided to surrender the city, but Inigo was too narcissistic, willing to exploits and insanely brave. Thanks to his charisma and eloquence, he managed to convince his fellow soldiers to fight to the end. However, the end came quickly enough. In the middle of the battle, Inigo was wounded by a cannonball, and after that no one disputed the idea of surrender. The wounded Hidalgo was rescued, which was a miracle in those days, but the disability forever cut off Inigo's military career. Bedridden for months, he wanted to escape into the world of chivalric novels, but the only books in his father's castle were hagiographies and religious treatises. The future founder of the Society of Jesus began to have visions, angels, and saints spoke to him. Partly because of a strong mental shock, partly because of information hunger, he became religiously minded. This is even more surprising given that Inigo had previously been completely indifferent to the church. And then Loyola decided that since he would never be an earthly knight again, he had to become a heavenly knight. He took the new name Ignatius, the place of suzerain in his dreams to God, and the place of the beautiful lady, the Virgin Mary. Instead of feats of arms, Loyola performed feats of asceticism. He starved, spent his days in prayer and penance, distributed property to the poor. At the same time, ambition remained at Loyola. The former knight decided by all means to succeed in the church, since the field of battle for him has become inaccessible. Further events in the life of Loyola took place according to the canons of classical hagiography. A vow of chastity, a 3-day confession in the mountain monastery of Montserrat, and finally a revelation on the banks of the Cardinal River. A year later, in 1523, Loyola makes a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to enter a Franciscan monastery there. But the head of the community refused the initiative Ignatius, clearly hungry not for humility and glory. The latter from some time perceived any defeat as a life lesson. From the refusal of the abbot he concluded, it is necessary to learn and teach. Having been defeated in Jerusalem, Loyola returned to study and preach in his own country. He quickly mastered Latin and entered the University of Alcala while still preaching. But even here things were not so simple. Although there was nothing anti-Catholic in Loyola's sermons, he was constantly persecuted by the official church, because only accredited specialists were allowed to talk about religion and God. The Inquisition treated Ignatius loyally, forbidding him to preach on pain of banishment. Ignatius accepted the ban without complaint and spent the next 6 years studying. Loyola, who did not lose his charisma, made a dozen students theologians something like a small sect. These people later became the backbone of the order. Gradually, Loyola transformed from a religious fanatic into a cunning and skillful administrator. Educated and ideologically savvy, the Knight of the Faith returned to preaching after the lifting of the ban, and this time managed to prove his case by obtaining permission to preach. Full of enthusiasm and zeal, Ignatius began to seek a meeting with the Pope himself. It was the 30s of the 16th century, and the Reformation was raging in Europe. More and more commoners, aristocrats, and even priests were coming under the banner of Protestantism. The Catholic Church was looking for any way to remedy the situation. In this environment, Loyola presented to the vicar of St. Peter the project of a new monastic order, which could be a sword and shield against the Reformation. Seeing Loyola's unprecedented initiative and devotion, Paul II decided, why not? In 1540, the pontiff approved the new religious order. What are the characteristics of the Jesuit order compared to other church organizations? The Society of Jesus was not really a religious order. Jesuits had all the rights of priests, but a minimum of traditional duties. But members of the Society of Jesus required iron, almost army discipline. Anyone wishing to join the order was obliged to swear an oath of unquestioning obedience to the Pope and the superior members of the order. As the founder himself put it, a Jesuit should be for his superior as a corpse that does not resist, no matter how you shift it. In this case, the Jesuit should not report to anyone but his superior in the order, and even the local bishops are not in order to him. At first, this principle was observed perfectly, but already in the middle of the 17th century gave slack. As the order grew, it became less and less manageable and more dependent on the local rulers, and of course their money. During the 30 Years' War, many French Jesuits supported not the Pope, but Cardinal Richelieu. But the famous schemer dragged France into the war on the side of the Protestant coalition, even though he himself wore the cassock of a Catholic priest. The interests of his native state prevailed over the interests of distant Rome. The obedience of the corpse, sung by Loyola, was a thing of the past. For a moderate fee, the Jesuit was ready to revise his oath of allegiance. The second difference between the Society of Jesus and other religious orders is a very unconventional approach to defining sin. The Jesuits realized that promising all apostates the torments of hell was no longer an effective strategy. But if you give any sinner a chance and do not close the gates of heaven to anyone, it will be easier to win supporters. Protestants with their puritanical morals call you a sinner, promising harsh penalties and demanding humiliating repentance. No problem, the Society of Jesus will help you find your way to heaven. We will always find a justification for your actions and a reason why your sin is small or even not a sin at all. Such flexible moral principles later became the object of ridicule in anti-Jesuit pamphlets. The parodies masqueraded as instructions for Jesuit preachers and taught them how to lie, milk their flock out of money, and not get caught. It was like bad advice for adults. Some took these parodies for real Jesuit manuals, but it is unlikely that the order would release such compromising documents. The most famous forgery of this kind is the Monita Secreta, or secret instructions. Of interest are the so-called spiritual exercises that Ignatius Loyola recommended to those joining the Society of Jesus. These were ways of seeing God and the angels, which had already been tried by the founder of the order. A sudden change of environment, hunger, physical and informational, sleep deprivation, and all this combined with attempts to visualize paradise, talk to the saints, and so on. In our time, similar methods are used for brainwashing in totalitarian sects. Apparently, many of the sect leaders have read Loyola's book on spiritual exercises. However, these methods were used very selectively, because the Jesuits were not brainless fanatics. It is unlikely that the Society of Jesus was originally created as a personal intelligence and subversive service of the Pope, although such an opinion, and there is such an opinion. It is not necessary to exaggerate this aspect of Jesuit activity. The main purpose of the society was to train high-quality Catholic preachers, charismatic, eloquent, and perfectly versed in theology, such that no Protestant could defeat a Catholic in a religious dispute. In addition to conflicts and persecutions, there were quite civilized negotiations and disputes between hostile confessions. First of all, a Jesuit had to be able to impress kings, dukes, and counts, on whom the religious policy of the state and the income of the order depended. Convert the king and a few of the most powerful people in the kingdom, and then you have money, power, influence. Those endowed with power, as a rule, are educated much better than ordinary burghers, and therefore the Jesuits themselves had to keep a very high bar. The argument, "I am right because God appeared to me and told me everything," did not work on the state elite, and therefore a high-class preacher had to be an intelligent, erudite interlocutor. This required an excellent educational system for those times, which the Jesuits managed to create. The typical Society of Jesus preacher was not a madman with burning eyes. He was a respectable and witty man of pleasant appearance. Attractive appearance and beautiful voice were among the first criteria for selecting candidates for the order. No less important was loyalty. The Jesuits could teach everything else. The Order of Jesus opened schools throughout Europe and promoted its values to students through teaching. Many graduates of Jesuit colleges expressed a desire to join the order or to convert to Catholicism. Even despite such blatant recruitment, European sovereigns did not close Jesuit schools. The Jesuits gave a really excellent education for those times, and this was considered more important than ideological differences. And most importantly, the preachers of the Society of Jesus emphasized their peacefulness and rejection of any violence. A Protestant monarch could not hope to convert all his Catholic subjects, but to pacify them with the help of Jesuits, to make them give up armed rebellion, quite well. Especially at an early stage in the second half of the 16th century, the order was not yet associated with corruption and export of revolution. Jesuit propaganda was a huge success. By the way, it was the Jesuits who introduced the word. Throughout Europe, as if mushrooms after the rain, multiplied colleges in France alone in the early 17th century, they numbered 36, and in the German lands, more than 50. The number of Jesuits exceeded 10,000. Some members of the Society of Jesus even managed to become personal confessors of sovereigns. And here is where the most interesting thing begins: big politics. The Catholic Church had a well-developed intelligence system long before the Society of Jesus was founded. One could say that the Church itself was an intelligence organization. Clergymen of various ranks were required to write regular reports on important events in their respective territories, be it a small provincial town or an entire state. An effective secret service necessarily requires a state bureaucracy. In the Middle Ages, an era of general devastation, the state apparatuses of feudal kingdoms were in their infancy. Not just educated, even literate people were chronically in short supply. The king could only have a remote idea of what was going on the distant borders of his dominions. At the same time, the Church had a fairly efficient and disciplined bureaucracy with offices throughout Europe. Not least because of this, the Pope constantly imposed his will on kings and even emperors. But the New Age came, and the Reformation clearly showed that the Church had become lazy and fat. The establishment of the Society of Jesus was an attempt to renew the crumbling system. A good intelligence service needs not only secret informants but also legal cover. The Jesuit colleges scattered throughout Europe were perfect for this role. They could recruit and train future agents. As already mentioned, not every college graduate joined the order after graduation, but how many of them were secretly working for the Jesuits? People and money could be funneled through legal offices. The role of Jesuit colleges can be compared to the role of embassies in modern espionage. The main centers of espionage became the courts of European monarchs. Jesuits recruited both aristocrats and ordinary servants, forcing them to act in their own interests. Many Jesuit agents worked to preserve and increase the power of the order, to destroy or discredit its opponents. If a Jesuit managed to become a confessor of the king, for example, João III of Portugal, other members of the order flocked to the court like wasps on the sweep. Wanting to please the monarch, many aristocrats also made their confessors Jesuits. In addition, the order educated the heir to the throne from a young age to inspire loyalty in the future king. By the 18th century, the power of the Pope had weakened considerably, while monarchies, on the contrary, had become stronger. The Jesuits by then already had a very bad reputation. Everyone knew that the order had been behind many conspiracies in the past and had spied for Spain. To tolerate on his land an organization that is professionally engaged in espionage and coups. Add to this the obvious corruption of the Jesuits. Pamphlets mocking Jesuit morality became fashionable. The poor image of the Catholic Church in general also played a role. It was the Age of Enlightenment. Interestingly, the first countries that banned the order's activities on their territory were Catholic: Spain, Portugal, and France. Seeing that the Society of Jesus had discredited itself and was now discrediting the Church, Pope Sixtus XIV in 1773 issued a bull dissolving the order. In some countries, the Society of Jesus continued to operate despite the Pope's ban. The reason is the same quality education that was given in Jesuit colleges. The Society of Jesus was revived in 1814, but the history of the revived order is boring and dull. Only educational activities, no intrigues and conspiracies. From the former power remained only conspiracy theories, any of which would be suitable for a decent fantasy novel.